We'll be opening up our webinar in just a minute or two. Hello, everybody. We are opening it up in just a minute. I am Anne Marie Carlson, Chair of the Committee on Teaching about the United Nations, CTON. Today, our group of educators is pleased to present a webinar focusing on the indigenous peoples of the world, along with some of the UN programs for moving ahead. We're very pleased to announce that we have 434 registrants today as we meet here on January 24th, the International Day of Education. Our land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge the facts as we gather here via Zoom, thanks to our ancestors, but on these lands in the greater New York area, with special thanks to the Lenape peoples, since these are their traditional lands. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continue to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. Our offices, homes, and communities are in these areas bearing names reflective of this past. Manhattan, from Mannahattun, Montauk, Seneca, Mashantucket, the list goes on and on here. And then there are the many others which were translations of Indian words, such as Quaropus, in my area, being translated into White Marshes, and then being named White Plains. Think of the backgrounds of your own areas. Today, to help us learn more about this heritage, some of the various indigenous communities worldwide, along with their struggles, accomplishments, and hopes, we've assembled indigenous leaders, representatives of key groups focusing on indigenous history, accomplishments, and challenges, including, of course, related leaders at the United Nations. We're opening with a short video recently released in September 2020, recognizing the 13th anniversary of the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Let's take a look at it.
There are more than 476 million indigenous people in the world, living in 90 countries. Indigenous peoples are responsible for conserving the planet's biodiversity, and so their role is crucial for humanity. However, recognition of their rights only began to be discussed in the United Nations from 1984 onward, with the creation of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. With the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by states in 2007, Indigenous peoples achieved recognition of their collective rights, such as the right to autonomy and self-determination, to freely determine their political condition and to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, the right to equality and non-discrimination, such that mechanisms are implemented to prevent and eliminate all kinds of discrimination against them, the right to free, prior, and informed consent on measures states wish to take that will affect Indigenous peoples, the right to health and to a clean environment to guarantee their life and survival. The UN has established mechanisms to promote and monitor the Declaration's implementation. But with 13 years having passed since the Declaration was adopted by the General Assembly, there are still outstanding commitments, such as recognizing Indigenous peoples' own systems of justice, guaranteeing the full right to free, prior, and informed consent, and implementing spaces to enable the discussion and construction of policies of cultural relevance, among other things.
We will be using Q&A, questions and answers, visible at the bottom of your page, and encourage you to post any thoughts and questions you might have there. It's our intent to answer questions towards the end of the webinar. Ramu Damodaran is our moderator for today's CTON webinar. Ramu, as chief of the UN's Academic Impact Initiative, UNAI, works closely with colleges and universities worldwide. He oversees these over 1,400 institutions of higher learning that have aligned themselves with the UN in supporting UN goals and mandates such as human rights, access to education, sustainability, etc. Plus, he's been a very active member of CTON's Advisory Council and has also spoken at a number of our conferences at the UN and around the country. We're very happy to have Ramu with us here today as our moderator. Ramu.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Anne-Marie, for that generous introduction and for setting the tone for our conversation this afternoon. As you mentioned, we are having this event today in the context of the International Day of Education, which the General Assembly of the United Nations has declared for the 24th of January every year. But today is also significant as an anniversary in another sense, because it is the 75th anniversary today of the very first resolution adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 24th of January, 1946, at its meeting in London. And I mention that for two reasons. One, because of the history that this day represents, the beginning of the process of legislation, of enactment of the United Nations, and also because of the subject of the resolution, which I'll come to in a moment. 70 years ago on this day, we were also at the halfway point of the construction of United Nations headquarters in New York, where, as you mentioned, Anne-Marie, the land where the Lenape people once lived. And you think of the words of King Pidi Sukung of the Lenape people and what he once said: when you begin a great work, you cannot expect to finish it all at once. Therefore, do you and your brothers press on and let nothing discourage you until you have finished what you have begun. And as we saw in the film that we've just seen, it took the United Nations almost 40 years after its inception to begin to consider questions relating to Indigenous people. Almost a century ago, in 1923, Cayuga chief Desake traveled to the League of Nations in Geneva, and it was his intention to argue for the rights of his indigenous people, to live freely on their own lands, to practice their own religion, and to follow their own laws. But he was not given the opportunity to speak and was turned away by what he called cruel indifference. That cruel indifference has, to a large extent, sought to be remedied in the history of the United Nations, even though it was only as late as 2007 that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted. Central to that is the idea of the right to be different, something that has sustained the United Nations in a whole host of other declarations and conventions. And also, in a sense, a forerunner of the Sustainable Development Goals, which recognized that the compact between a government and its peoples is not only national, but also international. I also mentioned another context of the Resolution 1/1, the first resolution of the General Assembly. And that was because it related directly in many ways to scholarship and education, because its subject was the problems caused by the discovery of atomic energy. And so you had scholarship coming to bear, in its way also very relevant to our subject today. When you think of the world's largest uranium company, Cameco in Canada, and the fact that it has always worked with First Nations, both in terms of the territory that it exploits or works on for uranium, and in terms of its governing board and corporate social responsibility, one sees that where it is possible for governments and the private sector to make use of the willingness and wisdom of Indigenous people, it is a situation that brings victory for all. Particularly in the last year with the pandemic, we think of metaphors like the Ubaya people of the Philippines, who always, at the beginning and end of their harvests, shutter their villages so that they can live within it, protect themselves from influences, evil from outside, both in a spiritual sense and a man-made sense, much as we are trying to protect ourselves today. UNESCO, with its local Indigenous knowledge systems network, LINKS, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which uses the wisdom of Indigenous people in developing crops across the world, are numerous climate change organizations, the fact that 80% of the world's biodiversity is in the hands of Indigenous people. The fact that the great rainforests of the Amazon, the deforestation rate in the territories which are inhabited by Indigenous people is less than 10% of that of the rest of the forest. Those are lessons that I think our conversation today will bring forward. In that spirit, I welcome all of you, as Anne-Marie has done. I invite you to join us for another film on protecting the rights and the well-being of Indigenous people.
They were always here, the original inhabitants, the custodians of our planet. They have lived on their ancestral lands in harmony with nature for centuries. Their cultures are rich and diverse. They speak the majority of the world's languages. They are the guardians of some of the Earth's most precious resources, and some of the most desired ones. The world's 370 million indigenous people are among the most vulnerable and disadvantaged populations in the world. They are facing increasing pressures to exploit their ancestral lands. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues gives them a voice an international platform to share their challenges and find solutions.
2030 agenda has given the Indigenous peoples a certain level of expectation and of hope that in this one, when they are going forward towards 2030, there will be some recognition and that it will be incorporated, their priorities, their concerns, their rights.
This year's forum will discuss the Indigenous peoples' collective rights to lands, territories, and resources, and other threats facing the Indigenous communities today.
And we hope that the end result will have positive impact to those communities who have been agitating when you talk about issues on land. And we hope even the recommendation can reach to the relevant government. And we also hope at the same time those recommendations can effectively implemented within the country and also disseminated to the community that they're affected.
I think, like with all other important international instruments and documents, the beauty and the power of all these is in the implementation. These are all like a roadmap. This is what the world has agreed it will do, and in this way, for the Indigenous peoples, as with everybody else, I believe, everybody has a responsibility. As Indigenous peoples always say, we are not the problem. We want to be part of the solution. We're not against development. We want to be part of development, but development on our terms.
The 2030 Agenda promises to leave no one behind. That promise includes the Indigenous peoples. By protecting the rights of its custodians, we protect the future of our planet.
It's now my privilege to invite our first speaker, Dr. Wilton Littlechild, great Canadian and international advocate in the cause of the rights of Indigenous people, who has been involved in those rights ever since 1977, when the first preliminary discussions on the resolutions began. Dr. Littlechild has worked within the United Nations to increase Indigenous input into the economic and social issues which the organization tackles, and within Canada on the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I'm sure he will elaborate upon in the course of his remarks. Dr. Littlechild reminded us that it was just under 11 years ago at the Winter Olympics in Vancouver that for the first time, the First Nation sportsmen took part in the inaugural ceremony, which in its sense was a symbol both of raising the flag and of establishing the identity which we so cherish and respect today. Dr. Littlechild.
Dr. Littlechild is having technical difficulties, so we will move on to the next speaker and come back to him when he returns. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm now privileged to invite a fellow member from the United Nations family, Nina Kanchieva, who is the Senior Policy Advisor of the United Nations Development Program. She is one of those responsible for the Equator Prize, one of the UN global initiatives that promotes the rights of Indigenous peoples and sustains their self-determination. She works to support initiatives and convenings that put the needs and priorities of Indigenous people and local communities at the center of all that we do. And she is the co-founder of Tashev's Aerials, an initiative to democratize drone technology. Nina?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ramu. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. And first, I just want to honor the fact that I'm linking in from New York City, which is traditional Munsee Lenape and Canarsie people territory. I'm very grateful to be here originally from Bulgaria myself. But I wanted to talk to you today about the Equator Prize, which is one way that UNDP and the UN identifies best practice and shines a light on the incredible knowledge and solutions that Indigenous peoples and local communities have. I'm going to start my presentation. And just 1 second, let's share my screen. Okay, great. I hope everyone can see this. Yes? Great. So I'll talk a little bit about the Equator Initiative today, which is a partnership of UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and government, civil society, businesses, and grassroots organizations to recognize and advance local sustainable development solutions for people, nature, and resilient communities. The Equator Initiative was founded when there was a study in the early 2000s that we realized that the greatest biodiversity is found in the same place where the greatest poverty is found as well, in the equatorial belt between the tropics of Cancer and the tropics of Capricorn. So the Equator Initiative was an effort to identify the best practices of Indigenous and local communities that were already doing incredible work. As you know, as we all know, Indigenous peoples have stewarded forests and landscapes for millennia for us on our own behalf, and it's only right that we acknowledge those contributions. More so, we need them today. We need them today because we're all facing a global planetary emergency that is experienced locally. And of course, the emergency that I'm speaking of is climate change and the loss of biodiversity, the loss of species. But it's experienced by each one of us differently. Local and Indigenous communities on the ground feel this change in the weather and climatic patterns much more profoundly. Here we have some statistics of how the nature and the sustainable development goals interact. For example, oceans supply 4.3 billion people with 15% of their annual protein. Forest, agriculture, and fisheries sustain 2.6 billion livelihoods. Forests also provide primary medicines for 4 billion and fuel for 2 billion, and 5.5 billion people depend on forests for their drinking water. So nature is tremendously important, and nature hasn't been at the center of development. And this is what the program that the Equator Initiative sits within a larger program inside UNDP. That program is called the Global Program on Nature for Development. And the idea of Nature for Development is to reinsert nature at the core, as the core that we organize our thinking around. And this is very much what Indigenous peoples have been doing and continue to do. Nature and their environment is at the center of their decision-making and thinking, primarily because they don't see it as a separate, it is not seen as a separate from themselves or from their lives. Here on this slide, I wanted to show you that nature is crucial for and has to do with each of the sustainable development goals here. And what we're proposing is that local, Indigenous, local community, nature-based solutions, this is the jargon that the UN is using, can help us tackle the planetary emergency and can help us reverse species loss and climate change. So what does the Equator Initiative do? Several things. The Equator Prize is one of those main pillars, but we aim to recognize and advance local, sustainable, nature-based solutions through the Equator Prize. We also support Indigenous peoples and local communities' efforts to influence policy agendas, including by acquiring tools and capacity to advocate for mainstreaming their solutions, concerns, and traditional knowledge into national and global policy. We promote and scale up Equator Prize winners' nature-based solutions. We try to facilitate engagement with governments and other stakeholders, and provide space for relationship building, networking, knowledge sharing, and policy dialogues through community dialogues and other events. So some examples of what are these nature-based solutions that I speak of. I don't want to be using too many terms, jargon, but it's important to understand that this is the practices that Indigenous and local communities have been carrying out for millennia. Things like forest protection, avoided deforestation, maintaining the forest standing, maintaining the mangroves, regenerative and other traditional agricultural practices for food security, coral restoration, non-timber forest products for income, and so on. So I wanted to focus here on the Equator Prize, and when I received the invitation, this was one of the key areas of interest. The Equator Prize is our effort to identify Indigenous and local community solutions and give them a global stage. I think I'm hearing someone's someone's phone call, but I'll carry on. So I'm sorry, let me go back to okay, so the Equator Prize, right? The Equator Prize is an event in person. 2020, because of the pandemic, was the first time that we held the award ceremony virtually, which was great in many ways because so many more people could attend the ceremony live. On the other hand, personally for me, I really missed meeting the Equator Prize winners in person and learning from them, and just having that experience in person. But the Equator Prize identifies, recognizes, and celebrates the spotlight on these solutions championed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. There have been 11 Equator Prize cycles since 2002, showcasing the work of 255 winners from over 90 countries. And there have been over 1,000 nature-based solutions identified in a database that we have on the Equator Initiative website, equatorinitiative.org. Last year, just to give you a picture, we identified and awarded 10 communities from around the world. We held a successful virtual award ceremony with 95 million social impressions. Nowadays, social media can help us really get the word out. And a diverse audience of about 30,000 people worldwide watched the ceremony live stream, including some of my friends here from the committee. The Equator Prize ceremony is our effort as the UN to provide this global platform and just basically give our name behind, put our name behind the excellent, incredible knowledge and practices of Indigenous and local communities. This is an event where we put together local and global leaders. This is from the 2019 in-person event. There's the administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Akam Steiner, the executive director of UN Environment. So it's private sector, UN, government, some celebrities sprinkled in there, to draw the interest perhaps of some audience members, but really the true heroes are the Indigenous and local communities that are receiving the award, and you see them here, the winners from Quimito Ene in Peru. We have winners from Ecuador and from Cameroon. These are only some of in 2019, we awarded 22 different communities, and in 2020, last year, we awarded 10 communities. I'll just give you what the winners get. So the winners receive a modest amount. It's $10,000. It does make a greater difference in some communities than in others. But more than that, more than the money, it's really the winners become part of our community. They become part of this Equator Initiative community. And then knowing these and having identified and learned about these incredible practices, then our job then is to promote them, to make sure that they inform and affect policy, and to scale them and replicate them, however that's possible. Another component I want to come to here before we move on is the peer-to-peer learning and how important it is. So along with the Equator Prize, the Equator Initiative also does something called the Equator Dialogues. And this is where the winners come together, usually 5 days or a few days before the Equator Prize ceremony, to learn from each other and also to learn something from us about engaging at the global level, advocating at the UN, and so on. But really building a network and learning from each other is also a very important component. what are some of the areas that these awards go to? What do these communities work on? Protected area management, one of the largest amount there, sustainable forest management, environmental education, eco-enterprise, land rights and tenure security are the top 5. Endangered species protection, value-added processing, ecotourism, credit savings and loans. You see there's so many different categories, but it's really, and most of these winners really do a combination of solutions. It's a holistic offering. So I wanted to just let images speak, and even though I wish that I could have here sitting next to me one of our Equator Prize winners, I will bring them through the medium of video, and I wanted to show you 2 of them. One of them is National Maasai Conservancy. They won the award in 2020. They are one of the first all indigenous owned conservancies in Africa. This is the Maasai in the Masai Mara, and really exciting. They've been doing some incredible work providing food security around COVID to all of the communities there. So I'll let this video play.
The most critical problem facing wildlife at the moment is the lack of space, lack of habitat. As Maasai community, we've been facing a serious threat. Because of poverty, people began selling their land. There was also a lot of fencing, cutting off wildlife corridors, and cutting off access. Even the community cannot move. So their livelihood, represented by pastoralism, was also threatened. We had an idea to break down the fences, to stop the land selling, and turn the land into conservation, to conserve wildlife, preserve culture, and reduce poverty in the community. Nasholai means the place where the soul of nature, the soul of wildlife, meets together with the spirit of the people in a commonly shared space, where people, wildlife, and livestock lives together in harmony. It's the only conservancy in Masai Mara that is community-driven, community-managed, community-led. If the community is not compensated for sharing space with wildlife, then they will just turn the land into other usages, which is not compatible with wildlife conservation.
The landowners are paid a lease fees, and we pay the rangers to patrol the land and to protect it from poachers who pose a threat to wildlife. We have created beautiful dams like this one so that our wildlife can drink from. We have regenerated our river, and we have a very healthy ecosystem. And recently we used our communication center as a space to make soap with the women, enhance sanitizers, and sensitize matters on hygiene, especially due to this pandemic by the name coronavirus. We have a feeding program where we are seeing 10,000 people getting fed, and it's amazing what communities can do when they pull together and take care of their land and take care of their wildlife.
Great. This is one wonderful example of prize winners. And sorry, I want to move to the next slide, but I think I have to bear with me a second. Okay, wonderful. Go back. And another example that I wanted to show you is because I have the great honor to share this, to be on the panel with Chief Littlechild, who I respect and look up to here in my work. This is a First Nation from Canada that has won the prize. The first time that a First Nation has won this prize. We recently actually opened up the nomination process beyond the equatorial belt to all Indigenous communities from around the world. Just recognizing that Indigenous communities often have just less resources really and access. So the prize now is accessible to Indigenous communities around the world and local communities and organizations in the equatorial belt. So this is an incredible example and story from the Lutselk'e Dene First Nation.
We were always told, and I can remember as a child, Nihohni, that means watch over the land. The vision of our elders has been to protect the land. They knew, the land needed to sustain us, and they chose the most beautiful area, I believe.
It's a big territory, requires a lot of resources. It requires a recognized law that non-Lutselk'e Dene will respect. Will make it illegal for them to do any damage to Taiganangene.
I'd like to welcome everybody to Lutselk'e Dene traditional territory. I'm glad that you all could make it here to witness and be a part of this historical day.
We brought the land, our law, and our way of life, and knowing doing to the table. They brought their law and some financial resources. The Taiganangene trusts that will be owned by the First Nations, the Lutselk'e Dene First Nations. That gives us real independence. We don't have to go to Canada or the government of Northwest Territories. By having access to the fund, we can bring Indigenousness in the management operations of Taiganangene. Indigenousness, the spiritual, reciprocal relationship we have with the land that most Indigenous people have with their lands and territories across the world. The land that gives life to us as a Dene, gives us a sense of identity, a great sense of responsibility. It will continue to provide that space that we can call home forever. And everybody needs a home in this world.
I'm very inspired by this example because much like what Ramu was saying in the beginning, how it took 40 years for Indigenous people's issues and concerns to be really taken seriously at the United Nations, which is heartbreaking, really. this is an example that it also took 40 years to negotiate the establishment of this protected area, because from conversations with Lutzel Kaidene First Nation members like Stephen, Nita, who you saw there, he said, this is how long it took to build that trust and to build that for the two worlds to come together on a shared foundation and a basis of trust, and that required that each side transformed and changed. I don't think I will have time to show you the 5-minute Equator Prize winner statement, but I wanted you to know that if you go to the website equatorinitiative.org, you'll be able to watch the entire 2 hours. Actually, it's an hour and a half. The virtual ceremony is an hour and a half. And you'll be able to see the very powerful winner statement. This was drafted by the communities themselves. This is one of the goals of the community dialogues, that all of the winners come together and they draft a statement that includes all of their priorities, all of their just call to action. What is it that they want to communicate to the UN and from this platform? So it's very powerful. It's also a beautiful film. It's just over 5 minutes, and I really encourage you to see this. It includes all of the 10 winners, and it's incredibly powerful. One other thing I wanted to tell you about our work, which you, the audience as educators, will find useful, is that we have a platform, a learning platform. It's called learningfornature.org. This is also managed here at our program, and it's the aim there is to have MOOCs, massive online open courses, webinars, podcasts, various Google Earth stories, and just all kinds of different ways in which we can communicate this work of putting nature at the center. And of the work of putting nature at the center, uplifting, highlighting the work of Indigenous peoples and local communities is front and center. It's what I'm committed to, and it's something that Learning for Nature communicates. But I welcome you. I believe as educators, you'll find the materials there. Hopefully, you'll find them helpful. There's different topics, and we're also open for collaborations if that's of interest. Before I wrap up my presentation, and I'm hoping that we'll have time to get into a discussion so I can hear what you're interested in, just also to know that we have internships at our program, and it's a great way to get exposure to the United Nations for young people, for college, master students, to get a sense. And I would really love to encourage Indigenous students of Indigenous descent to apply to these programs, and happy to be in touch with anyone who's interested. But thank you again. I welcome you to watch the Equator Prize ceremony. It's really lovely. There's great music, powerful statements. Dr. Jane Goodall introduces a prize. Sting and Rudy Styler introduce a prize. Lila Downs sings a beautiful song. It's just a really beautiful celebration, and a moment that we take to celebrate the successes of communities that are doing incredible work on behalf of all of us. Thank you very much. Feel free to get in touch with me as well, and I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was in your own words, it was a very inspirational presentation. And I think the idea of community and diversity, which you brought in, is also so relevant to the United Nations. I was actually thinking of the Juruna indigenous community in Brazil, which is well known for preparing food for students when they go to school. And over the past year, when schools have been closed, they have adapted that sense of community to be able to provide food to other members, those learning at home, their parents, their caretakers. So in a sense, both the adaptability and the resilience of indigenous communities, which the Equator Prize recognizes, which you so eloquently described, is something that stands us in very good stead today.
Yeah.
And I can think of few people who would personify that resilience as strongly as Chief Littlechild, whom I introduced earlier, but we could not link to because of technical difficulties. But I'm honored that he is now with us and would like to invite him to share his thoughts with us. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can, yes.
Thank you. Nigan gakio katam skadna. Mio sinoma. Imam skotamig. Bits now, eh? Snahamaton. May kan moteun sigason. Maskotsi sikoche. I just bring you greetings in my language, and I apologize for the little snag before I was able to join you on my phone. I've been listening and watching with great interest the previous presentations, and I'm not sure, I think someone has my slide presentation. If they do, could they put that up? So I'm going to skip most of it because of the time. I want to respect your time. I was going to give you a little bit of background from the early days of our work on developing the UN Declaration, and then give you some highlight sections of the Declaration itself and how to implement it, and then so on. So if you just go on to the next slide, I'll follow that. Next one. I usually use this visual as an eagle flying, where we say that our rights, our treaty rights in my case, are on one wing, and the UN Declaration are on the other wing. And it takes both wings to work together for the eagle to fly. In other words, for our rights to have the ability to soar. And if you go to the next screen, you'll see the initial warriors. In 1923, Chief Descahe went to the League of Nations and he was not allowed in. 2 years later, a Maori leader, Ratana, he went as well, and he couldn't get an audience. Chief Douglas from the British Columbia Treaty Territory. These three men went early. They were our forerunners to the League of Nations, trying to get us a voice at the United Nations. And of course, they were not allowed in. Chief Descahe, unfortunately, had an audience with the mayor of the city of Geneva, and was able to at least begin a discussion. In 1948, the next slide, you'll see a Canadian who was very instrumental in drafting the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. However, from 1923 to 1948, we had absolutely no voice at the UN or the international arena. Neither did we have a voice in 1948 because no one represented us. We weren't allowed to represent ourselves. So it was not till 1977, next slide please, till we actually had a walk, a peaceful walk into the UN. And this was the beginning of the journey. Not directly at the UN at first, it was at the ILO, the International Labour Organization, where we started. And they told us that we cannot discuss civil and political rights in this arena. This is for labor, economic, social, and cultural rights. So for you to discuss right to self-determination, for example, you have to go to the UN. So off to the UN we went. And fortunately, as Great Spirit works in wonderful ways, there happened to be a meeting at the UN on dispossession of lands of Indigenous peoples and discrimination. So we went to that meeting, again, only to find out that we cannot take the floor unless you're a non-governmental organization. So we had to borrow accreditation from people so that we could speak. So this was in 1977. And the picture you see there is a reenactment 25 years later. In 77, about 150 of us from all over the world gathered at the UN. And unfortunately, when we had our 25th year reunion, there were only 13, I believe, that came back. So if you're going to talk about the declaration, that's where it starts. And if you want to quickly just skim through these slides, I'm not going to go through the slides. What I will say at this point here, though, is that it was finally adopted on September 13, 2007, which meant that we took 25 years to get the declaration passed at the UN. Now, this is a picture of the first walk-in that you see on the screen now, I hope, where we had our elders lead us into the UN with 4 pipes and began the debates on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We did have a declaration that we had drafted, but it was rejected, of course. So the UN finally, after 25 years, adopted this declaration, and you'll see there's the foundational rights. Article 3, of course, is the right to self-determination, but on a screen you'll see the most fundamental right for us in our language, which means inherent rights. You're born with these rights. You don't ask anybody else to give them to you. So the UN thought different. Next slide, please. And you'll see that the right to self-determination is the, oops, okay, I'll skip all these slides. It's okay, stay there, because this was the other topic I was asked to speak about anyway, was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how it impacted education and promoted and advanced reconciliation in Canada. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the beginning of the Truth Commission. Let me give you a little background, first of all, on the Truth Commission. Some 13,000 students, former students of what was called the Indian Residential School Policy, decided they'd had enough and decided to sue the governments and the churches. And of course, with 13,000 lawsuits, the judges in their wisdom asked if there could be a settlement out of court. And if you flick the next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, we skipped all of them. Okay, I'll stop. This was the end of it. This is the end of it. This is my school. I spent 14 years in residential school. The policy by law was you were to be separated from your parents and put into these institutions for 10 months out of the year. Sometimes some students couldn't go home. The law said you were to be taken from your parents when you were 17. That didn't happen with me. I was taken when I was 16 and lived in this building for 11 years. So the first thing that happens to you when you enter this building is your name is taken. And anything culturally relevant, like your clothing, if you have braids, your braids were cut off, your clothing was taken, including your name. So my name is Mahigan Mohteo. In English, my English given name was Wilton Littlechild, but my residential school name for the rest of these years was number 65. 65, pick up that pen, you stupid. Or 65, you idiot, why did you do that? 65, come here. So you ask yourself, What happens to a child when you take them away from their parents and you take their name from them and anything culturally relevant to them? What happens to the parents from whom you've removed the children? This school that you see on the top floor is where the nuns used to live that ran the school. It was run by a Catholic church. The second floor is where the girls' dorm was. The third floor is the classrooms. And the ground floor is the dining hall. In the middle building, you'll see the boys' dorm. The big boys, middle boys, and little boys separated. And at the back, you'll see there's a horse barn, there's a cow barn, there's a chicken coop, and there's a hog barn. So as children, we basically took care of ourselves. We looked after ourselves. So when I was appointed as a commissioner, the most unique Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the world, unique because it's the first time it was court ordered as a commission because of the 13,000 lawsuits. But the survivors in their wisdom said, if we settle out of court, we're going to lose a chance to tell our story. So we want a truth commission established so that the world will know, or Canada at least will know, what happened to us as children, what happened to our parents, and what happened to the children that came behind. So we set up a commission, a truth commission, with a mandate to have 7 national events, to hold public events across Canada, and use a cultural approach. Luckily, we were very fortunate because we went to some elders who had gone to residential school, and we asked them, how should we do this work? And they said, well, you should actually look at our sacred teachings. Look at our sacred teachings. And I'm trying to find the slides here so I can show you, but if you go to the next slide, maybe you'll see. No, keep going, please. No, keep going. I'm trying to cut down time here. No, oh, you're at the end. I'm sorry, this is not the right slide presentation that was supposed to be shown. But in any event, we had 7,000 witnesses come to our hearings. And I have to say that you wouldn't want to go through that process of listening to children that were abused physically and mentally, spiritually, culturally, and worst of all, sexual abuse. Thousands and thousands of children told us about their horrific, horrific experience in these schools, including myself. I didn't want to do this job to begin with. I didn't really know why I didn't, but once I started hearing the stories, what was happening to me was I was hearing my own life story being told in front of me. So it was very, very emotionally difficult to hear all these sexual abuse stories, punishment. So when we asked the survivors, how should we go about our work? They said, since the courts has ordered 7 national events, let's take our sacred teachings and use them as themes for our national hearings. The first sacred teaching, of course, is respect. And in Winnipeg, when we had our first national event, 40,000 people came, and the theme was respect. And then we went up north, far north, for the second event, and the theme was courage. It takes a lot of courage to survive and live in the north to begin with. So that was an appropriate theme. The third teaching I thought would be very, very difficult because It was about love. The theme was love. And many, many, many times we heard stories from children or adults that, in their children's voice going back. I don't know anything about love. I know everything about punishment, but I don't know anything about love. And then this woman, a brave woman at the back, got up and she said, you know, I'm on a healing journey. And for the first time in my life, I can say, I love you. I look in a mirror and I say, I love you. I couldn't say that before. I couldn't say that to my partner, my husband. I couldn't say it to my children because I don't know what love is. You see, when you're severed from your parents at that age and you're kept in these institutions for 10, 11, 14 years like myself in 3 different schools, you lose your family bond. It's severed completely from your parents. I know my sisters and my brothers because they were there at the same place by name, but I do not know them as my brother or sister because of the fact that we were separated. So the schools were run by 4 main churches and they were contracted by the government. And it's interesting how they set up the schools because the prime minister of the day said, we're going to start this policy. And he sent 2 men out to go and find out how it should be done. And one man was sent to the United States because there was a boarding school here called, escapes my mind now. It is the first boarding school that was held. And then the other one went to France. So they came back, Carlisle, thank you, Carlisle Indian School. The man that went to Carlisle said, you're going to have to take them away from their parents if you want to educate them. But the fellow from the north, France, said you have to punish them because he went to the reform schools. So these 2 things, punishment and taking your children away from the parents, was the basic Indigenous or Indian residential school policy in Canada. When we started our work, there were still about 80,000 survivors alive. And we asked them, how should we do this? And they said, don't listen to anyone's story unless there's a safety blanket around them. Make sure there's a health supporter, a mental health support, medical, cultural support, spiritual support. And then you can ask the person what happened to you as a child. Because many instances they told us, I've been trying to hide this story for 50 years. 60 years I've been trying to hide this. My children and my family don't even know what happened to me as a child. I can't speak my language because the language, the culture, your family, your community were all assaulted by this policy. So many students, children, lost their language. I didn't fortunately lose my language because my grandfather who raised me could only speak Cree. He didn't understand or speak English. He didn't write English. My grandmother likewise. So when I went to a residential school at the 6 years of age, I went through the same experience as the stories that I heard about. But I had a fortunate blessing that I had an out. I used to wake up at 4:30 in the morning, and I don't know where I got this, but I found a flashlight, and I would put my blankets over my bed so that when the bell rang at 7, just before it rang, I would pretend I was just getting up like everybody else. But with the flashlight, I was studying under the bed. And then on Friday nights, we used to have these movies, the big reels. They'd close it off, the big playroom. And as soon as the lights went out, I snuck out with a pair of skates and I would go and practice and skate and skate and skate. by myself in the dark. Sometimes somebody else would join me. And that's how I ran away from the abuse. I would run at night and go for a cry because of what was happening to me. But you know, in a sense, that was a blessing because I took a liking to hockey, and eventually I played in 11 world championships in 9 different countries. I swam in 3 different countries. I played baseball in 3 different countries because that's how I ran away from the abuse. So after these 6.5 years of hearings, we asked ourselves, the 3 commissioners, what did we learn? What were the 10 main teachings from this journey that we've just done? By the way, the courts had ordered it for 5 years, but then they ordered it for another 1.5 years because of the extensive studies we had to do. One mandate they did not give us was what happened to the children that did not come home? Well, because it was not in the mandate, we decided we were going to study because we were hearing about these children who didn't come home. So by the time we finished, we found 4,300 children had died in these schools. The families didn't know where they were buried, when they died, how they died. So in our tradition, they couldn't close off by ceremony and tradition the death of a child to send a spirit child a farewell on their journey, spirit journey. So this work continues, and now it's over 6,000 names have been, names have been discovered where they died and where they're buried, so that the families now can at least put an end to the question, what happened to my child? I remember a woman talking to me and she said, the last thing I remember about my little girl is I was hanging on to her with both hands. Policeman took one hand away, the school principal took the other. And that's the last time I saw my little girl. Mr. Commissioner, you go find my child, she said. Then we heard about children being punished by their own punishments, because as you know, violence is a circle, and they treated their children the way they were treated. Girls told us, our mom used to wake us up at 3 o'clock in the morning and make us wash the floor with a toothbrush. And we wondered why she always did that. And then one day she told us, that's the way I grew up. That's what I was taught to do at 3 o'clock in the morning. The nuns would wake us up. We had to scrub the floor with a toothbrush. So with me, I think in a way it was meant to be. The way I was punished was with a hockey stick. I was punished like you go in a front rest position, they call it, like you're going to do a push-up. And then a supervisor hit me over and over and over the head. And my back especially. Right now I'm taking treatment because arthritis and spinal injuries are now setting in, not only from the sports, but from the previous punishments, I'm sure. So these children that died, we did a book on the names of the students we found, because we have to do ceremony. We had a 4-day ceremony where there was one grave that was found. We took 27 little bodies, little graves from there with traditional ceremony. I chose to carry a 6-year-old boy because that's all that was marked on the box, 6-year-old boy. So we took these children home to the community and we gave them a proper burial. But it was a 4-day ceremony where the relatives could come and have feast and prayer and say goodbye to their, not goodbye, but send off their child's spirit to the spirit world. So not only the abuse, but the loss of children. And then what happens to the parents when you take away their children from them like that? Many parents told us, that's when I went drinking. I couldn't take the pain of losing my child. I couldn't protect my child. So I went to drugs. I went to alcohol. I went to abuse. So one day, a young lady said to us, what about us that came after? I didn't go to residential school, but my parents did. My grandparents did. And then that triggered us to, in our hearings, have special days just for children. We call them education days. Over 14,300 students came to the schools, to the hearings, I mean, to listen to survivors tell their stories. And one little girl in Montreal got up and she said, I'm angry. I'm very angry. How come I didn't learn about this history? I learned about everybody else in Canada, and I didn't hear about this history. Why not? And it caused us to start having education days during the national events. And we had over 14,000 students come to the student days and listen to elders as to what happened to them. So it was not a good story in a sense of the truth. The court told us to go find out the truth of what happened and design a path to reconciliation. But I found very early that it's a spectrum. Yes, everyone has a right to know the truth. But secondly, when you're harmed like that, an apology is fitting. So the survivors demanded an apology from the Prime Minister on behalf of Canada. And he did apologize. In the United States, there was also an apology for the boarding schools. Unfortunately, it was hidden in the defense bill, so most Americans don't know about this history. Just as in Canada, when we started, only less than 5% of the population knew about the residential school policy. When we were done, it was up to 69, 70%. So during the time of the national events, we informed Canada about their darkest, saddest, most unknown chapter in Canadian history of what happened to 150,000 children, many of them dying. So you see that consequence unraveling in our streets today with the addictions, the suicides, the murder and missing Indigenous women and girls. When I raised that issue at the United Nations for the first time, we only had, and I know one is too many, but we only had 300 that were missing and murdered in Canada. Just as I finished my speech, a group of women from Mexico came to me through an interpreter and told me the same thing is happening to us. So now it's over 3,000, and that's been revealed by a public inquiry that we called for to find out how are these murders happening? Where are these little girls being captured and then taken away by foreigners? So this sad story, yes, it's the truth. Yes, that's what happened. As a lawyer, I had to ask myself many times, now do I know the truth of what happened? And when a man said, you know, I had horses, I lived right by one of the schools. Little boys used to come and sneak over and play with my horses. But you know what else I saw? I saw children burying children. So when a child died at the school, it was the children that buried the child. So how do you then try to fix this harm that was done? How do you try to use education and the UN Declaration to promote reconciliation? Because that's what we did. It was education that got us into this mess. And I call it a mess because I really believe it was education that would get us out of that mess. And I see that happening now. And I'm so encouraged that it's happening because we called for action. We made 94 calls to action on what Canada needs to do in different societies, different segments of society that were targeted to their industry. For example, it was corporations. Look at your national corporate policies. What is there in there that will advance reconciliation? If it's not, there's nothing, then find out about the residential schools. Find out what happened and then design a national policy for your own company on how you can advance reconciliation. We did that with the academia, the universities, the colleges. There's calls to action to the colleges and universities on how they need to promote reconciliation, one of which is to change your curriculum. Make sure that in your curriculum, the residential school story is being studied by the students. Make sure treaties are studied. Make sure the Crown and Indigenous relationship is studied in those schools. Make sure that anti-racism is promoted in those schools. So now the schools from kindergarten to grade 12 at home, it's mandatory that the schools teach these to the students. So it was interesting over a period of 2 years to begin seeing change in the youth, in the children, the students. In our community, we eventually took over our own school. The picture that you saw was the largest residential school at one time in Canada. Over 500 children were in there. Alberta, my province, which is a state for the United States, had the largest number of residential schools. So you would think that the largest amount of harm would have been done among our people in Alberta. So reconciliation is underway in the schools. The other thing we made as a call to action when I sat down with my colleagues and I said, we asked ourselves, what were the main teachings that we learned? The first principle of reconciliation is to use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. The longest debated declaration in UN history. Took us 27 years at the UN and 12 more in New York to get it adopted. 4 countries voted against it: Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Eventually, over a period of years, they changed their position. There were 144 countries that voted for the resolution to adopt the UN Declaration. 11 abstentions and 4 said no. Eventually, the 11 abstainers gradually changed to a yes. Eventually, after years, the 4 no became a yes. And it's now the most widely supported UN declaration in the world in terms of consensus. It has the largest consensus. So what do we do about this truth? What do we do about this harm? Well, it started in the schools. Let's begin that journey in the schools. Let's teach the story. Let's teach the story about what happens to children when they're taken away and they're put away like that. Their names taken away. What happens to the parents and the children that come after? There is a path to reconciliation. And I'm blessed because of a city near me. It's called the most pronounced city in Canada. It's called Wetaskiwin. It's actually Wetaskiwin. It means, it's a Cree word that means having good relations. And we as commissioners, when we sat together and we asked each other, what does reconciliation mean? And we came up with 3 words. It's about restoring respectful relationships. It's about restoring respectful relationships. That's what reconciliation means. So universities and colleges are now teaching in the Faculty of Education about this history. In the Faculty of Law, the law societies, the foundation, the law foundations, the judges are starting to learn about this history, because many times we're asked, how come you are the way you are? You're no good, you're lazy, you're a bum, you're a drunk. How come? And luckily, in one court case called the Gladue case, the story came out that you should make the link of the accused to the residential school and find out why he did what he did. And then another court case recently actually includes now in the principles, the first one called the Gladue principles, the judge can ask, is there a residential school history with the accused? Or the lawyer can raise that and say, Your Honor, there's residential school history behind the accused that you should know about and hear about. Now the judges are learning that as well in Canada. So the judicial community, the police, as a matter of fact, tomorrow I'll be meeting with police officers because of the deep-rooted racism that we've experienced recently, the systemic racism. So the academia, the private industry are beginning to do things. The sports industry, actually the most active advancement in reconciliation is through the sports teams. It's interesting how that's happening, but they're advancing reconciliation in a good way. Could be done in physical education, for example, in schools. So we broke our report into themes. First of all, it's about the missing children, and then it's about education, health. Why is it that we have so much illness among our people? Then it's about spirituality, because that was prohibited as well in residential schools. But the last one is reconciliation. So what are the principles? The 10 principles. By the way, the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when they did a study on reparation, redress, and reconciliation, actually said that we should have 10 international principles of reconciliation. So they took our 10 and changed them to be a global scope, so that now there's 10 principles of reconciliation internationally that are beginning to find their way through society. The language that was attacked in the schools prevented. We succeeded in establishing a language caucus at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which you heard about at the beginning. This language caucus, we decided we should call for an international year for Indigenous languages. And I had the honor of giving the opening keynote to that international year. But for the closing keynote, I spoke for 17 minutes in my language, not one word of English, because I wanted to welcome the next call we made, which is a decade for Indigenous languages. And that'll start next year. So for the next 10 years, I remember actually when I was upset, very upset when the decade was rejected the first time. I said 1 year of trying to revitalize and retain and maintain and strengthen our languages is not enough. We need at least a decade. For example, the World Conference on Racism, Against Racism, I gave the first keynote on that. Well, as you know now, there's 4 decades, the 4th decade against racism. So we'll be speaking our languages for 10 years, or focusing on our languages. Those that can't speak will relearn, because they say culture is healing and language is a part of culture, so that they're beginning to learn their languages as well. So one man said, when we asked him, what is reconciliation to you? He said, give me my language back. We heard a woman say, you took my talk, meaning she had lost her language. And the man said, for me, reconciliation would be, you give me back my language. And it reminded me of and it's a situation we were at, and I'll close off with this story. Have you ever heard a language die? Have you ever heard a language die? I did. During one of the meetings, we had not begun a meeting with a prayer. And the chairperson said, go and ask old man to say a prayer for us so we can begin this meeting. And he said, I'm very honored that you would ask me to say a prayer for us, because I am the last living speaker of my language. So listen very carefully to the sound of my voice as I speak my language. Listen to the sound of my language as I give thanksgiving. And he went on to pray. A month later, I got a phone call from someone, and all he said was, the old man died. I said, what old man? He said, remember the old man that prayed for us at the UN? He just died. So I heard a language die. And it was as if like somebody just hit me right in the middle of my stomach when I heard that. And I wouldn't wish it on anyone. So when we have this decade, I ask you, through your school systems, through your clubs in your societies, ask about our languages. Help us revitalize our languages, because it's going to be probably more than 10 years. When we took over our schools, our language had gone down to 9%. Only 9% of us could speak our language fluently. When we took over our schools and we made it Cree-based, treaty-based curriculum, mandatory for the children to take, to study the language, we're now back up to 15% already in 2 years. The chiefs in my community, the councilmen, they made a declaration that in our territory, Cree is the official language. In Canada, as you know, it's Canada's official languages, 2 of them, English and French. While we made ours, Cree will be the official language. So the children are beginning to learn that in schools. So that's how the reconciliation is unraveling through the schools, through our languages, and through our culture, returning back to our cultural ceremonies, through the songs that we sing. So with that, I'll stop here. I'm taking too much of your time. I apologize. I was going to show you a PowerPoint, but it disappeared somehow. So I hope that I can encourage you to do one thing, just one thing. Grab a book of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or look it up. Read the 4 to 6 articles, that's all there are. Grab a book of the 94 calls to action for reconciliation and read the 94 calls. Listen to the one that speaks to you and make a commitment to commit that, to act on that. Make a commitment to act on that reconciliation action. And then it'll spread even further and faster around the world. So thank you, and I apologize I took so much of your time. I really am sorry about that.
Chief Littlechild, thank you so much, and believe me, no apology is remotely necessary. As one of our guests, Elizabeth Morales, has said in the chat, we thank Great Spirit for giving you the strength to speak and tell the truth. We thank you for bringing in the concept of love, which is something so undervalued at the best of times. And thank you for bringing in really the rationale of the United Nations, restoring respectful relationships, which we learned from you and your people. There's another convention that the United Nations has done its best to promote, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And soon after that came into being in 1990, Canada under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien signed on to that convention. But one province, the province from where you're speaking, Alberta, chose not to sign on to it. Until one day, some years later, a diminutive South African came to a conference in Edmonton. And he met the Premier of Alberta, Ralph Klein, and said to him, "My name is Desmond Tutu. And I wonder, why have you not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child?" Now, Desmond Tutu, as you know, Chief, was the pioneer of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, just as you have been in Canada. And in many ways, the work both of you have done in terms of Indigenous people, in terms of rights of the child, bring to mind the very first line in the mission statement of CETON, the Committee for Teaching about the United Nations, that much of what the United Nations does seems far removed from the world in which the average student lives. Connections between the local and global affairs have been neither clear nor compelling. You, Chief Littlechild, have made them clear. You have made them compelling. We, sir, are in your debt. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very
much. It's now my
much.
privilege to invite Dr. Elizabeth Rule, who is an enrolled citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and director of the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, and assistant professor at George Washington University. She will be introducing to us 3 students, Terence Fields, Alicia Bandon, and Samantha Harrison, who will join her in a conversation about education and the possibilities it has in furthering Indigenous people's rights and in broadening their awareness amongst all sections of society. Elizabeth, thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you also to Chief Littlechild for your words and your stories and your wisdom that you shared leading up to our presentation now, which is about Native youth education and Native student serving programs that I run through the George Washington University right now. So welcome everyone. I hope you are all having a great day and learning, so much. We've had some wonderful presenters today, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm joining you from Washington, D.C. where I live and work. I am an enrolled citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, but I live and work here in Washington, D.C. As a faculty member at George Washington University and as the director of the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy. As part of that program, as part of our center rather, one of my tasks and privileges really is to administer the Native American Political Leadership Program. And that program has been in existence since 2006. So we are running for about 16 years now. And every spring and summer semester, we serve a cohort of Indigenous students from the lower 48 in the United States, as well as from Alaska and Hawaii. And so we have a cohort usually of about 10 or 12 Native students coming from all across our country to Washington, D.C., to our nation's capital, to really learn about the relationship between Indigenous nations and tribal communities and the federal government, the federal United States government. And really our goal and our purpose and our mission is to support those students in their own professional development as they become young ambassadors really of their home communities and of their home nations, working again between that local context on the ground and with, you know, the movers and shakers and policymakers that are operating here on Capitol Hill and throughout this capital city. So, you know, I myself am an Indigenous person. As I said, I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. And, you know, I have dedicated my life and my professional career to working with Native students who are coming, you know, through an educational journey of their own. And I'm very pleased today to introduce to you 3 of my current students. These are 3 students, again, who come from very diverse backgrounds, but who are all participating in the Native American Political Leadership Program this semester. One of the things that we discussed amongst ourselves and with some of the organizers as we were conceptualizing what we wanted to present and share with you about our program today was the fact that really NAPLP, as we call it, operates in so many ways as a microcosm of the UN structure, right? And especially when I think about something like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you know, it becomes so clear that this was this international effort, and there was so much collaboration and momentum around teamwork that made that possible, right? And we've already heard again from speakers earlier today about those connections between North America, South America, you know, Asia, Africa, and so on, and how as Indigenous communities we are really bonded together in, you know, in many ways of a shared experience of being Indigenous. And so one of the real beautiful parts about our program is that our students themselves are all Indigenous, but they come, as I said, from very diverse backgrounds. They come from all different tribes, including Alaska Native villages or corporations, and you know, Native Hawaiian communities as well. And so although when they participate in our program, they take courses in the classroom with me. I teach a class on federal Indian law. They also do internships, professional internships aligned with some of their interest areas and passion subjects. But they also just have that opportunity to be in a cohort and learn amongst each other from each other's experience and from, again, you know, those diverse backgrounds that are all coming together for a shared experience of wanting to be, you know, leaders, up and coming leaders for their communities. So with that said, I'd also like to mention that we run a high school component of this program as well every summer, and that is called the Inspire program. It was started in 2014, so has run for now 8 years. And if anyone is interested in learning more about our programs, I would encourage you to check out our website. That's going to be CIPP, like the Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, .cps.gwu.edu. And so now I've told you a little bit about myself and our programs, but what better way to learn about this work than to hear from the students' voices themselves. So I'm so happy we've convened a couple of my current students right now, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. So first, I'd like to introduce Alicia Bandine. She is Tohono O'odham and an enrolled member of the Akchin Indian community in Arizona. She is a junior attending Arizona State University and has an interest in pursuing a law degree in tribal policy. She is currently, as I said, participating in the Native American Political Leadership Program and is interning at the U.S. House of Representatives Natural Resource Committee for this semester. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to her for a few words.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Rule. As was said, my name is Alicia Bandine. I'm very excited and very honored to be able to speak here today on education for Indigenous peoples. I really wanted to discuss about why it is so important for education on Indigenous peoples, because that has led me to where I actually am today. And it was not necessarily an easy journey for myself. And I struggled a long time trying to understand what education meant, not only for myself, but what it meant for my community as well. I was very fortunate to have a mother who honed the idea of education as being something that's going to progress my future, as well as possibly progress the future of my community. And before I realized what that all meant, I was very much overwhelmed with the idea of having to be the one to go to school and not just do what I want to do, which I had no idea what was that even then. And even now, I met when I was in high school, an attorney, and I knew that I had passion for advocacy and policy. I just didn't know where to put that passion. And when I met an attorney, he turned out was from the Cherokee Nation. And I had never met anyone who was Indigenous and who was also an attorney. And that for me was such an eye-opener. I had never seen that kind of representation before. And I think for Indigenous youth, it is just as important to support education, because that representation is very much still strived for. And it is something that sets back a self-esteem and education. And so once I saw that, I was very much set on the idea of trying at least to make it possible to make a change in my own community. And that has led me to where I am today, and with the NAPLP program and interning this semester with the U.S. House of Representatives on the Natural Resources Committee has really opened my eyes to really what we all go through, issues with water rights, tribal lands, and tribal sovereignty. And it's something that education can be used as a tool and power for tribal nations and to help one another. And that's something that I would like to get across to other youth and myself, is just helping other nations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alicia. And next, I'd like to introduce Terrence Fields. Terrence is a proud member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. He attended the University of Central Oklahoma for his undergraduate degree, where he earned a Bachelor's of Political Science and minored in pre-law. Terrence is currently attending Oklahoma State University, where he is earning his Master's in Public Diplomacy from the School of Global Studies. During his studies, Terrence has been able to intern with the Dean of the House, Congressman Don Young, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and is currently interning as part of the Native American Political Leadership Program with the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
I guess I'll start. Nawa Akataru, Tata Sa Terrence Fields, Tata Kita Pawnee. Hello, how are you? My name is Terrence Fields, and I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, as Dr. Rule stated. Currently, I am interning with the United Nations, and my journey has kind of been the same as Alicia's. When I was a kid, I really had no one pushing me to go to college. My parents never went to college, and my grandparents never did. And in high school, I found a mentor who really showed me the possibilities of what can happen when you get an education. And they pushed me to apply, and I applied, and I went to college, and the first year was pretty rough. I wanted to drop out. I transferred schools, and luckily I was able to find a Native mentor at my college, a faculty member. And from there, she pushed me to keep going. And when times got tough, she was definitely there to help me through it. And from there, I saw all of the possibilities that education can do for me. Through education, I've been able to intern with Congressman Don Young through the UDAL program. I was able to study abroad in Germany with the State Department and intern for the Speaker of the House, and currently intern for the United Nations. I really think education is important, not only for myself, but for my tribal members. I really push it back in my hometown where it's majority Native. I want to eventually go back and help my tribe in tribal government, whatever that may be, and help them and lead them into the future. And that's all I can push for Native education. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Terrence. And then finally, I'm very pleased to introduce Samantha Harrison. Samantha Harrison is a current master's student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, studying One Health with a concentration on community advocacy. She received a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing and a minor in Sociology from Montana State University at Bozeman. She began her career working as an intensive care nurse for Indigenous populations at Alaska Native Medical Center. Samantha is Inupiaq and an enrolled member of the Native village of Kotzebue. She represents the Inuit Circumpolar Council as Youth Permanent Participant Focal Point for the Arctic Council, and is currently interning at Native Movement as part of her time with the Native American Political Leadership Program. So, Samantha?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Rule, for that introduction, and thank you all present today for this opportunity to share my story. Like Dr. Rule said, I am a nurse. I began my career working as an ICU nurse at the Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage, Alaska. And as a nurse, my background is primarily in the medical field. And so the Native American Political Leadership Program has been an amazing opportunity for me to make a pivotal shift in my career and transition into what I hope will turn into me becoming a lawyer in the future. Chief Wilton Littlechild shared so much with us about his own healing journey, and I'd like to take a moment just to do the same. I recently lost my little brother to an officer-related shooting, and like many other Indigenous people, especially youth that live in the Arctic, my brother was suffering from suicidal ideation, and my mother made a wellness call to 911 on behalf of my brother to ask for assistance from a mental health care provider. However, a SWAT team arrived and he was shot at 40 times by 5 officers. Now, this incident has played a pivotal role in my life and marked a very powerful mental shift for me. And as I progress further along in my education, I more fully realize how tightly the health of Inuit people and also Indigenous people at large are tied to the relationships that we have with government. And I also more fully realize how necessary pursuing education is in order to promote the rights of Indigenous people. As a lawyer, as a hopefully future lawyer and emerging leader, I hope to promote Inuit values both on the local level and international level, because I've had this very personal experience with the crucial need to create policies that will help Inuit people and Indigenous people, again at large, prosper collectively. I believe that the skills that I'm learning from the Native American Political Leadership Program are helping to prepare me for the work that I am currently doing, but also for the work that I hope to do someday as a lawyer, advocating for Indigenous people's rights. So thank you all.
So, thank you to all of our students, Alicia, Terrence, and Samantha, for sharing a little bit about yourself. What brought you to our program in the first place, what you hope to accomplish moving forward, your dreams and aspirations, but also, sharing, how you came to this point, right? Because it's a winding journey for us as Indigenous peoples in education and in educational institutions, as we've heard about already today. These are oftentimes fraught spaces for us, but again, with the Native American Political Leadership Program and with our Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, we really do our best to serve Native students and to perpetuate, all of the positive change and groundbreaking impact that education can have. Another area that I think is so interesting, and that makes my role as a Native student educator and as a Native person myself so exciting, is that our students, as you've heard, come from such a variety of different interest areas, right? So we have STEM, we have business, we have politics, but really, what our program emphasizes is that, if you're interested in environment, if you're interested in science, if you're interested in law and policy, if you're interested in history, if you're interested in the arts, all of these factors come together in Indigenous life, right? And I think really as Indigenous peoples, we don't have these necessarily siloed disciplines, right, in the way that a traditional university setting may separate these learning fields. So it's our role with the center to really show that, even if you're an Indigenous artist or you're an Indigenous scientist, you still can shape your community and have an impact in your community by, learning about the law, learning about politics and policy, because all of these areas come together really under that umbrella. And again, can be used and fused together to really, affect positive change. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I want to be mindful of our time, but thank you again to our audience and to everyone I see, sending supportive messages in the chat. I've dropped our contact information there, the students' Twitters, information about our program, information about our center. So I hope that you do reach out, stay in touch with us. And of course, if you or anyone in your family or circle or community are a young Indigenous student, please, look us up and maybe take advantage of our programs. We'd love to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And mental shifts are what the United Nations is very much about, certainly what education is about, but it should not require 40 rounds of ammunition killing your brother to have that mental shift. So Samantha, thank you for sharing that story with us. And thank you, Terrence and Alicia, for your own contribution for making this so first personal. You've talked about formal and informal education in this particular segment. I'd like to move to another area of education, which is, in a sense, possibly intuitive education, which is the education we acquire from museums and institutions of that nature. And it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Edwin Shupman, who is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma and the manager of the Native Knowledge 360-degree, NK 360-degree, Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indians National Education Initiative to inspire and promote improvement of education about American Indians. Dr. Shupman.
Thank you, Ramu. And good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. I'm very honored to be invited to present alongside such inspirational group of speakers today, and also to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our education work and how it might intersect with yours. So I welcome you and say Mado, thank you for spending this time with me. I'm going to take just a second to start my presentation. Okay. So I was very glad to hear the land acknowledgement today, as always. Indigenous people have long-standing complex relationships and connections with place, their collective memories, their cultural and historical experiences across millennia, and contemporary relationships and experiences as well. I am a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma, and a recent event occurred with my tribe that has to do with our ongoing relationships with the land. The original Muskogee homelands were located in what is now Georgia and Alabama. In the 1830s, most of the Muskogee were removed to Indian Territory, or what is now Oklahoma. These new lands were supposed to be ours forever, but that promise was not honored. And without going into the long and complicated history and the legal issues, this past year, the United States Supreme Court ruled that our lands in Oklahoma were taken illegally from us. And as a result, our legal jurisdiction now extends once again over a wide area of eastern Oklahoma, and our tribal sovereignty has been reaffirmed. This is a very proud and happy moment for the Muskogee people. The National Museum of the American Indian is part of the Smithsonian Institution. It's a complex of museums, libraries, and research centers. Our museum has 2 exhibition locations. One is in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall, and the other is in New York City in Lower Manhattan. Our collection of over 800,000 objects is cared for at the Cultural Resources Center, located in Suitland, Maryland. I imagine that you all are aware that there has been a long history of problematic narratives about Native Americans. Racist, demeaning, and biased terms and narratives began with the earliest encounters between Native people and Europeans and continued through the centuries. And even though they were not factually accurate, these kinds of narratives became institutionalized and made their way into the education system and into textbooks. A 1916 textbook called Essentials of Geography, second book, written by 2 professors, one from Colgate, the other from Columbia, stated, quote, that Columbus, supposing that he had reached the Indies or southeastern Asia, called the savages who met him Indians. North America was almost an empty continent, waiting for the white man to come and fill it with people. We are only a few generations removed from these kinds of overt statements. Millions of young children heard, believed, and lived their lives with these messages firmly instilled in their minds. And we know, of course, that this kind of really overtly racist language no longer exists in educational materials. But what is the status today? To examine these issues more thoroughly, our education department conducted a careful analysis of 28 of the most commonly used textbooks in 2012 and again in 2015. The list that you see here represents, across publishers, the most common narratives by far about Native Americans found in textbooks today. And there are exceptions, but these are the big ones. So you might notice about this list that everything up here, except for the last item, goes back 150 to thousands of years ago. So it's about Native people in the past. A good number of these stories are actually about the building of the United States. And we also found that these textbook stories never include the perspective or voices of Native people themselves. Dr. Sarah Shearer and some of her colleagues have also done a study of the 50 state history standards, coming up with basically the same results as we did with textbooks, that Native peoples are always portrayed in a pre-1900 context, that they're a long since forgotten episode in the country's development, spoken about in broad terms, and often blended with discussions of Euro-American destiny. So what happens when students get this kind of education? What are the behaviors, the perceptions, the attitudes toward Native Americans that result? Well, you've heard many of those exemplified by today's speakers. Native people still experience the effects of systemic racism, the issue of sports mascots, mocking, hate-based behavior, and violence. Unconscious bias are those things that we all carry but may not even be aware of. Examples of unconscious bias toward Native Americans can include such things as expectations about appearance, how Native Americans should look or what their culture is, or perhaps that they are the best fighters and really well suited to military, or that they're highly spiritual, very highly spiritual people. Bad education about Native Americans also has an impact on leaders at every level, people who make decisions, such as people who deal with the management of natural resources and legal issues of treaty rights, jurisdiction, and much more. One study of Native Americans in media found that contemporary Native people are represented 0% to 0.04% of the time. Everything else is historical. Every year, we get 1 million or so visitors to this museum who bring varying levels of knowledge and awareness, but there's often a surprising level of ignorance in their questions. Such things as, do all Indians still live in teepees? Are American Indians all gone? And of course, the effects on Native American children themselves, the consequences are often severe when they see their communities as stereotyped or locked in the past, or when they don't see themselves at all in their education. And finally, what about educators themselves? Well, teachers grow up getting the same kind of education that everyone else does. And they have very little in their preparation to become teachers that serves them in terms of teaching more accurately, more inclusively, and more appropriately about Native Americans. One of our highest priorities at the museum is to change what people learn and know about Native Americans. We started Native Knowledge 360 as an effort to transform teaching and learning about Native Americans and to have some support, to offer some support and to have some impact in formal education settings, in addition to those informal types of programs that we do within our museum. The first bit of work is to replace inaccurate and incomplete stereotypic stories about Native Americans. So to start with, we developed a framework of essential understandings based on the 10 themes of the National Council for the Social Studies Standards. We wrote sample key concepts under each of these themes. Let's think for a moment about essential understanding number 6, dealing with power, authority, and governance. One of the key concepts under this essential understanding looks at the idea of tribal sovereignty today within the United States. The fact that based on treaties, laws, court decisions, and various executive actions, tribes operate as sovereign nations within the United States. Principles of governing is another key concept within this essential understanding. We want people to understand that tribes were not, as racist narratives often depict, unsophisticated savages eking out a living in the forests. They had long before European arrival, complex systems of governments that recognized each other's sovereignty, that participated in diplomacy and made agreements with one another. This document serves as a foundation for our work at the museum. We share it with educators to help them think in more expansive ways and inclusive ways. I think you'll have a link to our essential understandings in the chat feature, and we also have it available in Spanish. But we want to encourage and support educators to think about Indigenous people in new ways. People who generated and participated in international trade and economics, engineers who built cities, agronomists who developed crops that helped feed the world today, environmental managers who created sustainable landscapes even before Europeans arrived, artists across time whose works belong in the world's great institutions of art, and very importantly, contemporary people who live in the modern world but deeply value and work to preserve their languages, cultures, and histories. Next, we are collaborating with Native communities, scholars, and educators to create new online lessons that offer a richer and more inclusive discourse. These are our screenshots of some of the online lessons we've produced that look at various topics in Native American history, culture, and contemporary lives. Our online resources are interactive. They employ the powerful pedagogy of inquiry. They utilize questions, rich primary and secondary sources, and tasks built in to develop student skills, such as developing arguments based on evidence. They address standards, and they are adaptable to meet classroom needs. And through videos and other sources, they feature culturally and geographically diverse Native voices, conveying historical and contemporary content. So to find our resources, I'm just showing you some screen captures here, not the live site. This is our home page. You can find it using the web address here. To get to the materials, you click on lessons and resources, and this will give you the opportunity to search using a variety of filters. We highlight some of the resources as well. Here you can see we have some resources focused on history or civics, some STEM related resources or geography. You go a little further down the page, you can see that we have some sources highlighted right now on foods, and also our Native Knowledge 360 resources in Spanish. These featured resources will change from time to time, so the best thing to do is to really just get onto our website, start to explore these as teachers. Please reach out if you have questions, and on our website you'll also be able to see when we have teacher trainings and professional development sessions that you can attend virtually for now, but eventually in our museum as well. We're also involved in a variety of professional development. As I mentioned, we have a Teacher Institute every summer, and we're doing a lot of webinars and online opportunities now. Part of this initiative, of course, is partnerships and working with other organizations who are like-minded to increase our impact and to support each other's work. So I'm very happy to be part of this organization's presentation today to help spread the word and to support our mutual efforts. So while we're seeing a lot of signs of hope, I think, in powerful and courageous acts against racism, against xenophobia and intolerance that are occurring today, these issues are only going to be permanently changed if we work at them over the long term. We have a long way to go to achieve social justice for Native Americans. In Native communities, there are still enormous disparities in health, economics, education, and other social issues. And some of these, as you've heard before, are real life or death challenges, such as the disappearance of untold number of American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls under suspicious circumstances. First Nations people as well, Indigenous peoples of Central and South America, women and children, and disproportionate numbers of COVID infections in Native communities. But this issue is not only about Native Americans. It involves all people. And it's about how we understand and tell and move forward with our collective story. I believe that education is where the hope for this lies. And it's in these rooms where children are educated, whether they're physical or virtual, that we can finally really address the poisoned roots of racism and replace them with empathy, compassion, and equity. So we'd like to ask you to join us in this work. We invite you to stay in touch with us. You have our website URL here and an email address. You can reach out to me with questions. I would like to thank the team from the Committee on Teaching about the United Nations and my co-presenters today. Thank you all again for your time and attention today. Hope you'll have a safe and healthy day, and hope to see you again. Mado.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Edwin, and that clarion call for empathy and equity. We are actually at the end of our scheduled time, but I would like to take a few minutes just to respond or ask the panel to respond to some of the questions which have come in the chat. I would request each of them to please limit their remarks to just 1 minute and answer the questions. I'm going to begin actually, as Edwin mentioned, the idea of nations within nations as far as Indigenous communities go is both a powerful and a constitutional one. And I did have a request or a question from Joanne Dufour asking whether nations in the sense of Indigenous communities can sign on to multilateral treaties such as that prohibiting nuclear weapons, which came into force on Friday. And the answer to that, I'm afraid, is in the negative, because the structure of these treaties is really open to member states of the United Nations. But having said that, there is no underestimating the power that First Nations or nations of Indigenous communities can exercise upon their political governments, which are represented at the United Nations, to take action. And we've already seen that in the environmental field, and could well see it, as you suggested, in the disarmament field. So let me now turn to a question from Deborah Mendelson, which should not be too difficult for Nina to answer. Nina, what is that lovely headdress behind you?
Great. Thank you so much. And the light has changed here as the day has progressed. Thank you so much to all the incredible sharings. So the headdress is from the Yawanawa peoples in the Amazon. This is in the Brazilian part, close to the border with Peru. And I was very honored to visit my friend Tashka Yawanawa. Some of you might know him. He has been at the UN many times. And I've met him. They're also winners of the Equator Prize from 2006. And when I was in Brazil for a conference, I was invited to go visit the community. So when I went, which was an incredible journey that took several days, and it was just one of the highlights really of my life so far. As I was leaving the community, I was given this beautiful headdress, and what I was told, the headdress is prepared for a special occasion with a lot of intention. And it has, you can still see, it was worn by one of the members of the community, and it has the beautiful genipapo, it's called, the black dye that is prepared from seeds that is used for face and body painting. And I welcome you to the Yawanawa. There's a lot of films on the Yawanawa, and I can drop some links so you can see something about their culture as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nina. Let me now turn to Elizabeth and the wonderful students with you. We have a question from Sarah Petit, who asks, how does one volunteer at the grassroots level in this cause? Sorry, I'm not, Elizabeth, are you still with us? Or? Well, if not, then I'm going to turn back to Edwin. Edwin, you talked about health in your presentation. You also made a specific reference to COVID-19. And we have a question here from Madeline Berkman, who asks, what do you see as the response of the Indigenous communities to the vaccine, or the readiness to take the vaccine?
I don't claim to have real expertise in this area, but as I read the news and listen to the media, I think there is, as there is in the general population, there's willingness and there's resistance, and but I think there has been such disproportionate devastation, death, and especially for elders, people who are in risk populations, that there's a lot of awareness of the importance of vaccines and support from the tribal governments themselves to encourage citizens to get vaccines and participate in the prevention of COVID.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Edwin. And now, Chief Littlechild, if I may turn to you, we have a question from Guillermo Renz, who asked whether you can reflect upon the famous speech of Chief Seattle and remember that one powerful line in it about take only memories, leave behind only footprints. I wonder if you could address that and also the idea of how one can volunteer at the grassroots level. Chief Littlechild? I can see you're with us. You need to unmute. Right, you've unmuted there. Thank you.
What was the question again? Sorry.
Sorry. Sorry, there were two questions really. One, a question about reflecting on the famous speech of Chief Seattle to the Suquamish tribe. And the other is, how can one volunteer at the grassroots level in the cause of Indigenous communities?
Well, the second one, in terms of volunteering, is actually personal initiative, I suppose I would say. I'm not really sure in if it's about reconciliation, for example. It's just to, as I said before, take one call to action that speaks to you and then work on it or implement it yourself. I guess first, the story I could attach to that is one of my own classmates once said to me that, Willie, I've been working on reconciliation for 10 years. I said, gee, way to go, Raymond, that's good. He said, no. He said, today is the first day I realized it begins with me. The reconciliation, I call it, begins with you, begins with me individually. So I think volunteering is just a personal initiative, really. As far as the first question, I think that the first quote, I can't add more to a quotation like that, except give you another one. My own elders here say that you have to know where you came from yesterday, and to know where you are today, if you're going to know where you're going tomorrow. And that's why I was trying to link my past development of the Declaration at the beginning to see where we are today and then where we need to go tomorrow in terms of advancing reconciliation together. So I know that's not a good answer to his first point, but gave me an opportunity to go for quote. Thank you.
It was an absolutely apt answer, so thank you so much for that, and for, I think, your beautiful summation about volunteering, that you must take action on matters which speak to you. I've often thought that the organization that helped us all get together this afternoon, CETON, the Committee for Teaching About the United Nations, CETON could also stand for the Committee for Taking Action for the United Nations, if I may borrow your phrase, Chief. And it's my privilege now to turn to the head of CETON, our host for this afternoon, Anne-Marie Carlson.
Wow. I've just been so amazed by the presentations we heard today. the personal stories. I would very much like to thank our presenters for the outstanding job that they did in sharing their Indigenous backgrounds and sharing Indigenous programs to help us learn more and more about what we can do and what the true stories, what the facts are out there. I'd like to thank also the many CTON members who have been involved. We've had a key team working just on this webinar since I'd say the last 4 or 5 months. And I'm looking now for the slide to appear with the names of the people who headed up this work. Mary Metzger, the chair, Christine Hanna, Elaine Callow, Isabel Campos-Anello, Julie Kasushi, Catherine DeLauder, and Kirsten Grunberg, because they've done a superb job in terms of deciding on what would be the best types of presentations, who the best speakers would be, what our resources should be that will be shared with all of you, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to them, we also have some of our CTON officers. Vice President Connie Rensink has been very helpful in pulling everything together, as you could see today. Peter Brosnan, Director at Large, has done so much for this particular webinar. And of course, Elizabeth Schumann, our Executive Coordinator, who has helped us pull everything together. So there's a large team here that we're behind this the whole way. But going on, the loss of Indigenous elders has also meant irreparable losses in the culture and history of these communities. As part of the Verified initiative in Brazil, in partnership with the United Nations Information Center in Rio de Janeiro, and its director, Kimberly Mann, who happens to be an old friend of CTON's, we're privileged to show a short special video. It focuses on the work of graffiti artist Tito Ferreiro and the mural created in downtown Sao Paulo, Brazil, paying homage to the many Indigenous elders lost to COVID-19. So if we could see that short video now.
Ayantan kayapoko aretatari kipa ipoturik kona ayantan inapuro imanakuneka itishichi ao kutishi upikari akoki ayantan aminari minatari ireoki katemake kore kayampoko aitichi kuna aiwai kuna isepekana anikari noneakatari itere imanatona achikini shika sampuriantan noneakata aiwatari imarore nenoa tapanapo imakuneka materena achna iza imanapari kipa achna minaka kia manari minaro tokori puna ayanta ayamatenena awat anikari atere tekari ananerema kokitsi nanowata owa atam san kirechi kuna Kimaro tekori atam atna atsopata.
Em dezembro de 2020, já haviam mais de 41 mil casos de Covid-19 entre 161 povos indígenas do Brasil. E desses casos, mais de 890 mortes decorrentes do vírus. O vírus chegou às aldeias mais isoladas e está numa crescente ainda maior. As perdas são irreparáveis. São povos com culturas distintas uma das outras, com idiomas distintos e que a cada morte de uma liderança morre junto uma biblioteca. A cultura, a sabedoria e os ensinamentos dos povos indígenas são passados de forma falada, de geração para geração. A morte precoce de uma liderança significa a quebra desse ciclo. As consequências disso são imensuráveis. Será mais uma perda de todos os povos originários brasileiros. que sofrem decorrente das ações que realizamos nos grandes centros urbanos e atingem de forma muito mais agressiva a floresta e todos os povos indígenas. Nossa obrigação como população é dar voz, visibilidade e direito aos povos indígenas, para que de alguma forma possamos reparar e nos responsabilizar pelas diversas perdas que já causamos, e não o contrário.
Superou a minha flecha, minha nudez se tornou escandalização, minha língua mantida no anonimato, cair na mata ali na urbanização, mesmo vivendo na cidade, nos unimos por um ideal, na busca pelo direito, território ancestral.
And we very much thank Ramu Damodaran for being our moderator today. We would be lost without you, Ramu, and so much value your assistance in all that we do. We thank all our registrants for coming, and then we encourage them to look for ways in which we can all help our Indigenous sisters and brothers. Everyone, do look for future CTON invitations to special events that we're going to be continue planning for the future. Thank you all again for joining us today. You will see follow-up information on our CTON website, www.teachun.org, and you will have access to many of the presentations. Thank you again.